I come from the deep south, and our refuge received one of the phone calls saying that a tender for our property had been given to another agency, but because we have been operating unfunded since 1997, we've been able to stave that decision so far. So we have a refuge for 8 mothers and 11 children at the moment, and they've just discovered that our safety is on a knife edge. First of all, I'd like to thank the No Refuge Collective for the collective wisdom, support and knowledge, and this is why women's services exist. And this is why women's services and women's collectives and the women's movement needs to be involved in this issue. If my organisation is defunded, and we are at great risk of being defunded, or if we had not chosen to tender as a result of my speaking out, that's a risk worth taking at this time, because my responsibility is not to any corporation, it's not to any organisation, it's not to the government, it's to the victims of violence. That's why I'm here. The Department of Community Services, they used to be called the Department of Community Services, but both the community and the humanity have left the building. It's now the Department of Human Services. They were responsible for funding domestic violence services and women's refuges, and now they've practically tendered them out of existence. They say they've given their tenders to those whose evidence and accountability is far greater than the women who've been running DV refuges for the last 40 years. The department has preferred the tenders of the Catholic Corporation, the Anglican Corporation and the Wesleyan Corporation. The department offers DV services through their Sitting Ducks program. It's also known as the Staying Home Leaving Violence program, where a minority of women affected by domestic violence feel safe living in an environment where they were assaulted and abused, and they wait hoping and believing that a piece of paper will stop the perpetrator from returning. For most of the women approaching our service, that program is not at all helpful. The department now offers a homelessness service to survivors of domestic violence, and it's risking lives by reducing the access to women's refuges. The word refuge is significant. It's not a homelessness service. Already half of all women seeking a place in a women's refuge must be turned away because we don't have enough of them. And now women approaching needing a women's refuge will have to stand in line with all the homeless. And these people may be homeless for reasons that in themselves put domestic violence survivors and their children at risk, and also may re-traumatise them. The evidence is that in New South Wales, 87% of DV survivors are women. The evidence is that domestic violence is the only criminal charge that is increasing in New South Wales, not reducing. Hence, the need for women's domestic violence refuges. This is the time to increase safe women-only refuges, not close them down. And as we hear, a minimum of 18 women's refuges are closing as of today. This policy, focusing on homelessness, fails to address the actual risks from DV perpetrators. It ignores the reality of stalking, of tracking survivors through technology. It ignores all the systems failures. Like, for example, only one example, releasing perpetrators from prison without informing their victims. In our area, we've had a horrific murder last year, and one of our clients in our women's refuge had to be moved again and again and again. She went to a generalist service, and the perpetrator tracked her and burnt that down the day after the day after Mother's Day. This policy will not provide the level of safety and access to safe accommodation that DV survivors in New South Wales need. In 2013, 28,291 DV assaults were reported in New South Wales. Again, 87% of those assaults were of women. This policy will force women and children to return to violent and abusive homes. We all know that. We can all see that. It fails to provide protection to children and will cause more children to witness and to experience violence, with the resulting effects on their futures, on their capacity to handle school, on their capacity to form relationships. It will cause more children to be taken from mothers unable to protect them or unable to find safety from ongoing stalking and abuse. And it's highly likely that it will lead to more domestic homicides. The rate of the murder of women and children in Australia is shocking. It's already unacceptable. It's unacceptable. And we're bordering on an increase in those homicides. The public's already horrified by them. This is not the time to be losing women's refuge. It's the time to be funding more of them. In actual fact, in both places where this type of policy has been previously trialled, the evidence, we hear a lot about evidence from the department, proves it to have been an abject failure in protecting women and children fleeing domestic violence. It's in the UK and Canada, and you can source that research if you are interested. By introducing this policy without any public consultation, the department signals that it knows it will fail to protect, but it's ramming it through anyway. By acting on this policy so quickly, the department is clearly demonstrating to the public its own failure to act in the interests of women and children needing protection. And just as the department is walking away from its responsibility to provide protection from domestic violence, it's also walking away from its responsibility to provide child protection. It's walking away from providing services to Aboriginal women and to other vulnerable women. More Aboriginal mothers are having their children removed than ever occurred during the stolen generation times. Asian girls have lost their only women's refuge. The recovery from violence and abuse needs a better response than a bed and a case plan. The new homelessness services are sacking children's support staff, sacking domestic violence specialists, sacking Aboriginal staff. We need to stop this so-called reform now. We need to turn back the culture of callousness, ignorance and contempt that's invading Australian politics before this policy invades the rest of Australia. The evidence is that churches have covered up DV and child abuse. Pastors and ministers have advised women to return and stay in abusive and violent homes. They have advised the forgiveness of perpetrators who were never made accountable. They ignored the evidence that domestic violence is largely perpetrated by men on women and children. They ignored the reality of and the research into perpetrators, into their motivations, their complex calculations, their exploitations. The question I ask myself, and I'm sure I'm not alone in this, is who will protect the women and children in the churches? The evidence is of the church's remarkable ability to overlook the catastrophic numbers of children abused, women abused and mothers killed. The Department of Human Services seems remarkably unable to recall the evidence worldwide that feminist women's refuges are the most effective response to male violence against women and children that have ever been devised. The department's preferred tenders largely went to the churches that failed to comprehend gendered violence, failed to protect children from paedophile priests, failed to protect the children they took from Aboriginal parents, and failed to respect Indigenous culture and beliefs. The Department of Preferred Tendering has handed most of the 18 refuges closing today, and many of the more to close in October next year, to the same churches that are attempting to defend themselves at the Royal Commission into Institutional Child Sexual Abuse. So when is a human rights worker not a human rights worker? In Australia is when she's a woman working for women's equality and human rights. Then, as we've seen in the media, she becomes a medieval monster with horns riding a broomstick, also known as a feminist. Women's refuges arose from feminists in the community, not from churches or corporations who ignored the need for them, as they still demonstrate today by turning women's refuges into homeless shelters. These refuges are social capital, they're our social capital, given and purchased as women's refuges, built on community support and goodwill, and originally staffed by volunteers. Gendered violence requires gendered recovery. Recovery from rape, from being subjected to gendered psychological abuse and insults, from being overcome by male physical power. The male networks that continue to support male violence and the abuse of women and children. From the beliefs that it's right for men to control women. Women seek recovery in women-exclusive environments, and mothers best understand how domestic violence impairs mothering and harms children. Created by women for women worldwide, women's refuges are our right and not a privilege to be taken away by government, by their whim or their opportunism, as in this case. New South Wales Government has a human rights obligation to provide women's refuges. This policy has got to be the most unpopular social policy in decades, and I know because I'm constantly out getting people to sign petitions about various things. The response to this petition is absolutely remarkable. But this policy's got two things going for it. Its blatant depiction of the departments absolving itself of the responsibility for the safety of domestic violence victims, and the blatant self-interest of the churches, corporations, prepared to take the money the department offers, such as it is, and to take away women's access to the refuges they need. Secondly, this policy is doing a great job of showing how far politicians and policymakers have lost touch with the real lives and the real values of its own citizens. If ever there was a strategy designed to invigorate the feminist cause and create support for it, this policy is up there as a winner. As a consequence of this reform, we see the department slide accountability, heard that quite a bit lately, for child protection and for women's safety from the government onto private church charities. They do have the benefit, as church charities, of being tax-free, but these preferred tenderers will be the ones on the hot seat at the next Royal Commission into the domestic murders of mothers and children. This reform in New South Wales represents an agenda of calculation and self-interest already sending shockwaves across the nation. It's causing Australians to fear the loss of compassion and fairness in social policy. It's fuel for debates about the ideology that punishes and despises the poor, the vulnerable, and now those most at risk of harm. If the government pushes through with this so-called reform and the others it has waiting in the wings, it will become the most despised government in New South Wales history. Blind Freddy in a blindfold opposes this reform. Its only backers are certain members of government and the religious corporations. This reform is a disgrace, and the public is now learning to know it. We need to take strong action to halt any more refuge closures. The reform will be a failure. It's already making that clear. So let's make it fail sooner when there is less damage, rather than later before more heartbreak, more tragedy, and more deaths.
So if you want to speak, come find me. I'm hanging out on this side of the marquee. You can be presented however you want, as anonymously as you want. You can say as little or as much as you want. Well, maybe not too much, but you know. Sorry, maybe 5 to 10 minutes. The next person I'm going to invite up is a worker from Lillian's. It's a youth, a refuge for 14 to 18-year-old girls in the inner west. Before she comes up, I just want to say, this is a list of refuges that we know of so far, Independent Women's, Aboriginal and Young Person Services, that are going to close in the coming weeks. Taree, East Lakes Women's and Children's Refuge, Tweed Heads, Wagga Wagga, Forbes, Bringar in Dee Lismore Women's and Children's Refuge, South West Women's Housing, Newcastle Youth Accommodation Service, Walganura Aboriginal Women's and Children's Service in Wallsend, the Yakaba Centre in Nelsons Bay, Upper Hunter Community Services Muswellbrook, Ungaroo Aboriginal Corporation Singleton, Tukli Women's Refuge, Katakadu Women's Housing in Wyong, Jessie Street Refuge in Blacktown, and Wimla and Katoomba taken over by Penrith Women's Health Centre, Essie's in Reedy Hill taken over by DV New South Wales. So a lot of these services, as we said, they're being taken over by the big peaks, 75% of which Christian organisations. They will no longer function as they have as independent women's, Aboriginal and youth services.
Shame!
And refuges with no funding at present beyond October 31st include Lillian's, include Liverpool Youth Refuge, Young People's Refuge, Lotus House, Cabramatta, all these are youth services for young women 14 to 18 years. Joan Harrison in Liverpool, Jack Walker Aboriginal Service in Ashfield, Inari Housing Marrickville, Jean's Place Tempe, taken over by Vinnie's, St Louise Lodge Sydney will no longer even be a domestic violence service, let alone an independent women's refuge. Queen Bienne, also no longer going to be a DV service. Wollongong Family Housing, taken over by Vinnie's, all staff sacked. Bathurst, St George Women's Housing, Grafton and Forbes. These are independent or were independent women's, Aboriginal and young person services that will no longer function, have no guarantees of ongoing funding beyond October 31st. And if they do get the scraps the government is throwing at them for an extra 18 months, it'll be to run programs that are fundamentally different, that are no longer feminist and run under those principles to address gender violence. It's disgusting. So on that note, someone who works at a service, one of those services, to come to the stage.
Hi, I'm Cindy. I work at Lillian's Refuge and have worked there since the early 90s. We're a young women's service in the inner west for 14 to 18-year-old girls with complex trauma. We house 8 young women at our service, and we have been impacted profoundly by these reforms. But what I want in our service, but all services, and particularly feminist services, that you know what we do and you know why we're important, because we still live in a world where power, privilege and access is influenced by our gender, our race, our intellectual capacity, our age, the way we look. And it is feminist services and anti-oppression services that look at these issues and work with their clients from this perspective. And at Lillian's, we have lots of young women who come from all sorts of different cultures who, for a start, they're young women. Then they come from, culturally diverse backgrounds. They come from places where they're kind of looking at their sexuality outside the heterosexual box. And the framework with which we work sees each young woman as unique and deserving of the rights and entitlements of a person who actually has all the power and entitlement and privilege. So as far as we're concerned, we have young women who come to us who have no education. And when I say, they haven't had access to education, they have not been to school. They haven't, they come from such a level of violence and oppression that their self-esteem is completely shattered. Their sense of entitlement is zero. So we need to work with them, not just to build their self-esteem up and heal them on a kind of personal level, but to empower them to know that they are entitled beyond what the world tells them they're entitled to, beyond what is the kind of framework and, environment that we all live in. So for me, feminist services that are culturally specific, services that are sexuality specific, need to exist. They, until we have a world that is equal and fair, we can't have a world without these services, and they have to be run by people who understand and challenge these concepts and who are working toward, empowering their residents as well as helping them on a personal level, because I think the empowerment process is as important as the healing process or the psychological healing process. So the political aspect of the work that we do is really relevant to how we change the lives of our clients. You know, when a young woman comes to us, she doesn't believe she's entitled to anything, you know, or believes that she's, you know, entitled to very little. And the world continues to tell them this, you know, through their experience. So I can't say enough that Lillian's needs to keep going. We need to keep serving young women in our age group. And that all services that work from a political perspective as well as a healing perspective need to be funded, because, you know, it's not, we don't exist in a world of psychology. We exist in a political world. Everything's fucking political, you know? So I think that, you know, I'm really, really grateful to this collective for supporting us. I'm grateful to everyone who's supported Lillian's. And we've just got to keep up the good fight. Thank you.
Anyone that's worked at Elsie's, used Elsie's, started Elsie's, want to come to the mic? I've got Christina who's going to kick off that. Christina was at Elsie's here in Glebe on the first day that it was squatted. You going to come up, Christina? And anyone else that wants to step up and talk about that, more than welcome. I'm just over here.
Hi. One thing I must say before I begin is it's great to see young women involved in this process still after 40 years. Because we were very young on that Saturday in, I think it might have been around March or April in '73, when while a group of Glebe women had been meeting for some time over finding a solution for homelessness of women, it took organisation by a group of feminists concerned with the issue of domestic violence to organise the occupation of Elsie in the old street in Glebe. And there was about 50 women turned up from everywhere, all pre-arranged. We jumped the fence, the gas and the electricity were connected, and the collective started, and we had many collective meetings. And we developed that first model, and we had a lot of publicity. Anne Summers did a magnificent job of alerting the media and orchestrating that. And we had women come to us straight away, and we were staffed 24 hours a day by volunteers, all in their own time, working on a model we had talked through to some extent, but dealing with new challenges all the time. And it gave me great pleasure, because these were the days to kidnap the Minister for Health, Dr. Everingham, for the opening of Leichhardt Women's Health Centre, and travel with him in the Commonwealth car to Westmoreland Street, Elsie, where I took him inside and gave him a tour and gave him the rundown. And he wasn't the only politician who visited us in those days. Tom Uren used to make, after we were funded even, used to make evening visits to talk about the issues and how there was a deep concern. So I'm saying, don't give up the fight. Please let there be some organisation now to stay and if possible, occupy the remaining feminist women's and children's refuges. Thanks.
Right, this is a message from someone I was speaking to who works in a regional service and couldn't be here today. They say, we're a well-known service in our community. We've operated for 30 years. Our personalised approach will be over. We tried for a combined tender package, but other agencies wanted to compete with us. We had no time to inform clients. They found out about the service being taken over by Vinnie's in the news. It's like going from a corner store to Woolworths. Bigger isn't always better. We've specialised in complex case management. Homelessness isn't an issue in isolation. Our workers have done a lot of study across domestic violence, mental health and drug and alcohol. We can make quick decisions because we're small. For example, this winter we got clients extra blankets in all the houses within 48 hours. The big agencies, they won't do that. This reform isn't about better outcomes for clients. It's not about making more housing available. This is a funding restructure for the department reducing staff in the public service so that they can make cuts there too. This government has been unapologetic about that. Housing in Australia is getting worse. We work with lots of refugees and migrants. There's no housing for them. We're seeing a lot of people who we haven't seen before, who haven't been homeless before. All of a sudden you get families who can't make their mortgage repayments. And the same goes for us workers. Most of us are just hanging on amidst all this insecurity. There have been no guarantees for staff under the big new agencies that are taking over. And Abbott prefers church systems. 50 years ago, most welfare was provided by the church. This is a return to that. Church orgs have been the big winners in going home, staying home. They pay people the lowest and get away with what they can. The reform has been going on for 2 years now. They reckon they've consulted. Then how have they put this together? It's totally contradictory to the information the sector gave them.
Everyone, I just thought that I would like to give you a little bit of a perspective from the situation from a migrant women's point of view. As a migrant, I haven't experienced myself domestic violence. I was lucky for gender violence, but I have worked as a volunteer in a refuge that used to be in Tempe. I don't know if it's there anymore. And I can tell you, many migrant women who are escaping gender violence, violence against women, one of the two, or they got their family here, and sometimes those families are so extremely conservative, pro-male and anti-women, that there is no hope they can count on their support to get out of a violent situation and fight for their safety. Some other women don't come from families like that, some other migrant women, but we don't have our families around, which means we are totally alone in our fight for the safety of ourselves and our children. And I think it is extremely dangerous that when we consider the diversity background, the diverse background of many of those women seeking refuges, that a bunch of fanatic Christian religious zealots are going to take control of our care. Please do everything you can in your power to stop it. Thank you.
If you come to us late, I'll just repeat the list of women's independent services closing today. There's Delvina in Lane Cove, Maruya, South Coast, Marcia's Campbelltown, Elsie's here in Glebe, Dolores in Bondi, Bega and Alawa House. They're the ones we know of, and it's been really hard to gather this information. Workers really feel like in their redundancy contracts, they can't speak out. You know, they're scared because perpetrators threaten them with violence. Imagine surviving domestic violence, using these services, how much bravery and courage it takes to stand up here and speak in front of a group of people. Like, so humble. If anyone else wants to come and have a quick yarn, you're more than welcome. You want to say something? Oh, we've got a statement to be read.
I have been given a statement by a survivor. She grew up in domestic violence and as a child had to use a refuge, so it saved her family. I speak as a survivor. It is too hard for me to take the microphone, even though I've spoken at many rallies. In our rural community, we were isolated from extended family and other support networks when we left in the night. At first we slept in our car, then my mother got us some space in the local women's refuge. It was difficult, sometimes cramped and stressful, but we were safe. Later, outside the refuge, living without my dad and without his income, Mum went to the local Vinnies for help with a power bill. The man across the table said, "I notice on your form it says you are a Mrs. But I don't see a wedding ring on your finger." My parents were de facto. I can't remember if we received the help we needed with the bill, but as an 8-year-old girl, I got a lesson in humiliation and disempowerment I will never forget. I will never forget. Women's refuges must remain independent and women-centred. without the judgment of religious organisations. Lastly, thanks to the women who inspire me, working in Refuges, you make a huge difference.